Thanks, everybody. Thanks to everyone that joined. Thanks, ODI, for organizing this amazing event. Glad to be here. Thanks, Stuart, for the kind words. We're very happy to be here to discuss the role of data in the climate action agenda. And with me, I have Dr. Eliane Abalijoro, sorry. She is Executive Director of Sustainability in the Digital Age and the Global Hub Director for the Canada for Future Earth. She has decades of experience in academia, science, policy, and nonprofits and international development sectors. She's a professor of practice in the public-private sector partnership at McGill's University Institute for the Studies of International Development. She's also a member of the Impact Advisory Board of the Global Alliance for Sustainable Planet, and she's a member of Rwanda's National Science and Technology Council, as she has been a member of the Presidential Advisory Council for the Rwandan President Paul Kagame since its extension in September of 2007. She's a member of the expert consultation group of post-COVID-19 implications on the collaborative governance of genomics research, innovation, and genetic diversity. Eliane is a member of the African Development Bank Experts Global Community of Practice on COVID-19 response strategies in Africa, and she's a member of Capital Coalition Supervisory Board. She's also a member of the advisory board of the Earth Leadership Program, and she's a member of the advisory board of She's Equity Orango Investment Corporation. She's also in the board of Genome Canada and Corp Trust. So she has a lot of experience. Eliane, thank you very much for being here with us today. Glad to have you on board for this panel. And if it's okay on your side, I will go straight into the first question, which will be, how would you define nature-based solutions for everybody that has joined but doesn't know exactly what the terms mean?
So for me, I really like the IUCN definition in terms of the International Union for Conservation in Nature as actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges effectively and adaptively, simultaneously providing human well-being and biodiversity. And what's important is, according to IUCN, nature-based solutions are intended to support the achievement of society's development goals and safeguard human well-being in ways that reflect cultural and societal values and enhance the resilience of ecosystems, their capacity for renewal, and the provision of services.
Whoa, that's amazing, an amazing response. I hope everybody here now has kind of an idea of what we're going to be digging into, because the next question, Eliane, is what is the role of nature-based solutions in the climate change mitigation and adaptation? And I know we're in COP week, so this is a massive issue right now.
So I think what's important is that, they were put in place, specifically to address issues of food security, climate change, water security, human health, disaster risk, and economic development, all really critical elements that we know today all of us are facing in one way or another. And so what's really important to understand, it's the opportunity to place how we're looking at science globally, and also how can we bring in indigenous science and knowledge at the heart of climate change, mitigation, and adaptation, which we have so far not been as successful as we would all like. And it's really important to realize that we really need to look at this in terms of what are the best ways to protect nature, is to protect the human rights of those who live and in harmony with nature. And so that has to be really central to how we look at nature-based solutions.
That's a really thoughtful question. And so now that we are in ODI's summit, how can data support the design, the scale up, and the effectiveness of nature-based solutions?
So one of the things that is really important is data can support nature-based solutions in many, many ways. For example, in terms of reforestation, what we know is this has gained interest as a main method for carbon sequestration to mitigate climate change. Yet what we also know is that more scientific data is needed to really determine which areas really need reforestation efforts, and also to allow us to figure out what are the actions to enhance the natural regeneration, and under which ecological restorations intervention. So what we need is more data that is also to inform decision-making and make sure that we're not looking at replacing native forests with monocultures, and ensuring that afforestation is happening in areas that aren't already valued and of use of local and indigenous populations. So it's really critical that we use data to support human rights as well as our ability for carbon sequestration and mitigation and adaptation strategies for climate change. And so that interface of how data can be used for nature's rights and human rights is really, really critical.
Totally agree on that. So as far as understanding what role does indigenous knowledge needs to play in this success for nature-based solutions?
So indigenous knowledge for me is very, very critical. We're at a time where how we look at the digital age we're in really depends on the level of consciousness we bring to it. And the reality is indigenous science and knowledge has been around for tens of thousands of years. And without harnessing it, what we do is we're using the digital age with blind spots. And so inclusive innovation is really critical to ensure that nobody's left behind. And the only way to really do that effectively is ensuring that indigenous science is central to all our decision making, and that how we harness artificial intelligence and other ways of knowing today are aligned with the knowledge of our ancestors, the knowledge of indigenous peoples, so that we ensure that how we move forward takes into account 7 generations down the line, which is in terms of Canada, indigenous populations in Canada, is really the governance framework to work with. And so we have to make sure that as future generations come, that what we adopt as nature-based solutions aren't answering the urgency of now, but are really ensuring a future that is better for generations to come.
Totally agree. And we know that solutions for the climate crisis need to be collaborative, and everybody needs to get involved. So what would you think are the data collaborations that we are missing that could improve the implementation of nature-based solutions?
So that's a really important question. In terms of the collaborations, you know, as we just talking about, the importance of including indigenous points of views is really critical. Ensuring that how we have boots on the ground being involved in the problem definition and solution finding is really critical. And what we also know is this is multi-sectoral, it's multidisciplinary. So it's really important that how we look at nature-based solutions and integrate collaborations has to bring the most diverse sets of eyes and hearts and brains to the table to ensure that we are not unknowingly doing harm when our intent is to do good.
Totally, the checks and balance on anything. And one final question. How can nature-based solutions and engineering solutions complement and catalyze each other? And what data do we need for that?
Okay, that's an excellent question. What we really need to consider is that nature-based solutions have to be looked at from a holistic perspective rather than specific, somewhat siloed strategy to complement or catalyze another. So one of the things that is really critical is how do we look at nature-based solutions in ways that can be solutions in rural and urban areas. So what we know is that there are man-made solutions that are being put in place, but that nature would be more effective. How are we designing cities in ways that are green, that allow for climate resilience? We know that right now, climate change in terms of floods is the highest cost in terms of climate events in the world. How do we design cities for green spaces to be able to absorb the water? How do we ensure that the wetlands around the world are being preserved? Because those wetlands act as sponge. And so when there's excessive amount of water, they're able to absorb it. So how we design cities and urban areas and how we adapt to this changing climate really requires that we re-green cities, that we think about green infrastructure wherever possible. And often it's also interesting to realize that green infrastructure can cost a lot less and can be a lot more resilient in the long term. And so one example is a quote I have by Andre Hoffman, who's the president of MAVA Foundation, who says that provisions by nature are not only more sustainable, but often also cheaper and more stable in the long term. And a recent report in May said that global annual spending to protect and restore nature needs to triple this decade. And what we know is that there's about 4.3 trillion worth of infrastructure needed worldwide. And a lot of this, if we look for green projects, we can save over $248 billion per year. So there's a lot of work that can be done, and we need to look at nature-based solutions beyond just afforestation, but really looking at how can green infrastructure benefit all and make sure we're including Indigenous peoples and local communities so that we're moving forward in sustainable ways that don't increase inequities, but actually empower all people.
That's a great answer, Eliane. We have 2 more minutes because the time just run. So do you have any final comments or any final notes for our participants here in the session and everybody in the ODI Summit that you want to wrap up with?
Great. So one of the things that's really important, it's important for us to look at nature-based solutions, but also to realize that nature-based solutions will not mitigate how our economies are run on petroleum fueled energy. And so one of the things we critically need to do is not to think that we can keep having these economies that are run on unsustainable energy sources, but to look at how do we increase the sustainable energy sources that we use collectively, while also looking at nature-based solutions in terms of all the ecosystem services that they provide. And so that even though they may not be the highest level of sequestration available, they're really critical to how we move forward. But let's not use them as band-aids and make sure that we're using them in synergy with all the strategies we need to make sure that the next 9 years count.
Okay, and so I've been advised that we have a few more minutes, and I know we are in COP week. So is there anything in particular that we should be looking at as far as nature-based solutions discussions that will take place in these next weeks of COP?
So I think it's important to look at how are nature-based solutions allowing us to bend the curve on biodiversity loss and how critical that is. I think it's important to also realize that how do we ensure that we're not substituting afforestation to allow cutting down of old growth forests. The old growth forests may not be contributing to additionality in terms of carbon sequestration, but they're very critical to ecosystems. And so I think it's really important that we ensure that the areas that we have, wetlands, old growth forests, are really conserved, and we ensure that as we're looking for ways to increase carbon sequestration, we also stay very, very aware of the continued loss of forest areas, whether we think about the Amazon, whether we think about old growth forests and temperate forests. I think of British Columbia, for example, in Canada. And how do we preserve the Congo Basin in terms of the old growth forests that are there? And so it's very critical that we make sure we're not thinking in duality, but we're thinking holistically. And I think this is something very critical to make sure that nature-based solutions aren't being used for greenwashing, but are effectively being used as part of a multiplicity of tools that can really help us mitigate and adapt to a changing climate.
And are there any champions that we should be aware of during this week, like trying to follow up what they say or what they do, if we want to get more info on this?
So for me, I really think it's critical to be paying attention to all indigenous experts, speakers that are showing up, because their voices are really critical and need to be amplified and supported. I think the voices of youth are really important because they're fighting for their future. And there's an expression that I really find really astonishing and important, is how do we decolonize the future? Because we know that at the rate of climate change right now, that a lot of places may disappear, that there will be continued forest fires, there will be continued rise of sea levels, and island states are vulnerable. And so let's make sure that this decolonization of the future happens so that all of the areas in the world that are highly susceptible to climate change are being taken care of in ways that are urgently needed, as well as are viable in the long term. And so for me, it's really, let's pay attention to island states because they're so vulnerable. Let's pay attention to all work that is related to wetland preservations, because wetlands are very critical and will become more and more critical. Let's pay attention to peatlands and how important they are, and how important it is to be careful to focus only on profit, and the need to look at a capitalist approach where we consider not only profit, but we consider human capital, social capital, and natural capital. And we see these as critical to how we live our shared values. And what else I'd like to also make sure is, this is a time of deep change that is needed. But that deep change will only happen if we fully live our interdependence. So let's live our interdependence so that we can bring on the transformation that will ensure that nobody is left behind.
Yeah, and that's critical. Like, we are all together in this world trying to figure out the best way to secure a future. We have a couple of questions coming from the audience, if that's okay with you.
Yes.
So the first question that we have is, what about the impact of data and AI on the environment? Might it counter positive actions?
So there's a lot of discussion on how data mining and AI are increasing uses of unsustainable energy. So I think it's very important that as we move forward, we think specifically, how do we design and place data centers to maximize green infrastructure? So for example, they can be placed in areas that have winds that allow cooling. They can be placed in northern areas where you don't need as much air conditioning to keep the computers cool. And those are things that can be done. You can look at elevated areas that may have cooler temperatures in the tropics. So I think it's very important to think about that. It's very important to think about, how do we bring the energy sources to be 100% renewable in terms of our data centers around the world, and how we use AI. We also need to think about, how do we make design algorithms that don't eat up so much energy? And so how do we consciously design algorithms that are more sustainable in terms of needing number crunching energy? And so it's very critical that as we design AI, we look at how do we do it sustainably, because we know that data is important, but we also know all of these issues related to accelerated use of data globally. And we need to make sure that as we walk the talk in terms of using digitalization for greater environmental sustainability, that digitalization itself is powered by sustainable energy.
Yeah, that's an important discussion that it's taking place. Like, how do we bridge the digital divide, but also make a greener proposition to build that. And then I have one more question that maybe doesn't have to do exactly with nature-based solutions, but we are starting to see governments saying like they want to go into green recovery processes from COVID-19. So what's your vision on that? What are your thoughts on these international speeches that they're giving? Like, are they actually green? Is it possible to do a green recovery from COVID?
I think COVID, as terrible as COVID has been a time of deep reckoning in terms of our global shared values. I think COVID itself has reflected the crises in terms of shared values. What we know in terms of, we've had epidemics in the last decades, and COVID didn't come out of the blue. So what we know is that as we've lost over 50% of biodiversity, emerging diseases are finding that humans and the animals that in our food systems, as well as our pets, now represent 90% of the mass of mammals on the planet. So we are the #1 hosts for emerging infectious disease. So we have become more and more vulnerable to emerging infectious disease. So bending the curve on biodiversity loss is very critical in terms of stopping future pandemics. And I think a green recovery is the only way we will be able to meet the Sustainable Development Goals in the next 9 years and be able to stop the rise of temperatures in terms of the climate change. So it's very, very important that green recovery happens. However, it's important to ensure that how we build policy towards green recovery includes a diverse set of voices, so that we are not putting in solutions that will not work in the long term. And so this is why it's so important that youth that are at the table, that indigenous people that are at the table, that we have social scientists, technical experts, we have those AI people, but we also have people thinking about social justice. And so we really need all of this expertise advising policymakers, so we ensure that the policies that are going to be coming forward for a real green recovery are informed by the best of minds around the world, so that our collective intelligence is used to effectively harness a pathway forward that is green, that is sustainable, and that will stop more emerging diseases from affecting humanity.
Yeah, and there I can see how data can play a major role in like informed participation, follow up on the agreements that governments reach, and part of that collaboration that needs to happen. And so that's also what we are working on from the Open Data Charter, and it's important to understand that we need data out there so that we understand what decisions are being made, but also to be able to participate in an informed way in these collaborations that are taking place. So now we are in the final 7 minutes of our session, and we don't have any more questions from the audience. So I was thinking maybe if you wanna now, yes, please forgive me. I thought we had to wrap up 5 minutes ago, but if you wanna give a final speech on a wrap up on this and an overview of COP for us, not from the climate change agenda, what to look for, where we can see data discussions that could be interesting for us, and I'll leave it up to you.
So I think one of the important areas I think that we really need to pay attention around the data space is also how are we looking at data and gender. What we know is that solutions that really take into account gender are really critical in terms of accelerating positive solutions we need to take moving forward. I think it's really important that we look at care and fair principles in terms of ensuring that we're moving forward with data in a responsible way that benefits all. And it's really critical to we think about how are we creating interoperable systems? And I love an expression you use is how are we creating interoperable relationships of humanity, because it's really about our interconnectedness. And the more we live our interconnectedness, as I said earlier, the more change will be possible. And so I think it's really critical that we see data as not only sources of insight, but also how we use data as a reflection of the consciousness we collectively bring to the work that is needed for transformation to happen. And without that level of consciousness, how we use open data can be detrimental how we move forward. We really need to make sure that we're doing this in the most inclusive way possible, that we think about how do we ensure benefits come to all, and how do we ensure that as we're creating this open data framework, who was defining those spaces? Who was defining how is data being used? How do we ensure that the smallholder farmers in the world, that the indigenous populations are not only beneficiaries, but also producers of data, stewards of data, so that as we move forward, we're really doing this where bottom-up approaches are influencing what is happening on the COP stage, where we have global leaders showing up. So how we're looking at global governance is very critical, and data and how we use data is really important at that interface, because we're really, the 21st century is all about distributed leadership and harnessing data to ensure that bottom-up approaches are being met by governance structures that are looking at the meta level, the meso level, and the micro level, and that action is happening in all directions so that we're influencing the systems at the micro level as well as the meta level. And those are critical. And this is where data is critical for decision making, because we can have wonderful universal principles, but they need to be localized. And they can only be localized if we have boots on the ground contributing to what are the needed data sets, so that they know which are the data sets that they feel important, that we have dialogues between experts globally and the knowledge keepers locally to ensure that we're not bringing blind spots to how we're putting forward data. And so this is really critical. And so I'd say, as we go into COP, listen to the voices of the marginalized, listen to what they have to say. Make sure you champion those voices, make sure you amplify those voices. Let's make sure we increase literacy around digitalization, around data, and let's make sure that that drives how we're going to have a pathway forward that's sustainable and that really ensures that we can all be contributing, not only as consumers and users, but really as producers and designers of a future where we collectively harness data for good.
Thank you very much, Eliana. It was a pleasure for me to have this conversation with you and to share it with everybody at the ODI Summit. Thanks once again to everybody who organized this session and this event. And I think we will be leaving the floor back to the ODI team.
Thank you, Nati. It was a pleasure talking to you today. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Stuart, the floor is yours.